The storm arrived in the middle of the night, no warning, no time to prepare. By morning, roofs had collapsed and families were standing in the snow with nowhere to go. Children were crying, animals were freezing, most homes had failed, but one unfinished stone house was still standing. Built by a quiet cowboy, everyone dismissed. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, subscribe and share this story with someone who needs hope. Santa Fe entered winter the way it always did, quietly, without ceremony, as if the land expected people to already know what was coming. The mornings turned brittle first. Then the nights followed, stretching longer, colder, stripping warmth from anything that stood still too long. Wind moved freely across the high desert, unbroken by trees or mercy, sliding through streets and open fields alike. Houses that had been built fast and light began to complain, wood snapping as it contracted, doors rattling in their frames, thin walls failing to keep the cold from creeping inside. In this part of New Mexico, winter was not dramatic every day, but when it arrived fully, it demanded respect. Those who ignored it paid slowly. 30 miles south of the city, near the smaller settlement of La Cienega, the land opened wider and the cold felt sharper. Fewer buildings, fewer people, and nothing to stop the wind once it gathered speed. It was here, on a narrow stretch of elevated ground just beyond the main road, that Calder Ridgway decided to build a house. Calder was 33 years old. He carried his age in the way men do when life has already tested them. No hurry in his movements, no wasted energy. He was tall and lean, built by years of riding and manual work rather than intention. His shoulders were straight but relaxed, his posture shaped by long days in the saddle. His face was angular, weathered without being worn down. A faint scar ran along the bridge of his nose, the result of a horse spooking years earlier. His beard stayed short and uneven, more neglect than style, and his dark hair was sun-faded at the edges, usually hidden beneath a hat that had softened with age but not fallen apart. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, observant, the kind that missed very little and reacted to even less. People in La Cienega described Calder as quiet, not unfriendly, just contained. He spoke when he had something to say and stopped when he was done. He didn't laugh loudly or argue for sport. When conflicts came up, he stepped around them unless they stood directly in his path. That restraint was not natural to him. It had been learned. Years earlier, back when Calder was still young enough to believe strength could fix most things, he had lost his younger brother to a sudden flood. A dry riverbed had filled in minutes, water tearing through the canyon without warning. Calder had been there. He had tried. The memory stayed with him, not as guilt, but as a lesson carved deep and permanent. Nature did not explain itself, and it did not slow down for regret. Since then, Calder planned carefully. He paid attention. He built his life the way he approached a skittish horse, slowly, deliberately, with respect for forces that could not be controlled. He made his living as a cowboy, taking work where he found it, fence repair, cattle drives, breaking young horses, jobs that required patience rather than flash. Ranchers trusted him because he showed up when he said he would and finished what he started. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't chase trouble into town on weekends. He earned steadily and lived simply. What set Calder apart wasn't how much money he made, it was how little of it he spent. While other men treated their wages as temporary, Calder treated every dollar as something meant to last. He rented a small room for years, cooked his own meals, repaired his own gear until it couldn't be repaired again. He saved quietly, without announcement, without complaint. At first, the money stayed in a small metal box hidden under a loose floorboard. Later, when the box grew heavy, he carried it to the bank in Santa Fe. The banker, Howard Lasky, noticed him immediately. Howard was a man in his late 40s with carefully combed hair and hands too clean for the work Calder did. He wore pressed suits and spoke with polite precision, the kind that sounded friendly but never invited familiarity. Howard watched Calder's deposits grow month after month, always the same pattern, steady, unremarkable, persistent. One afternoon, unable to help himself, Howard asked what Calder was saving for. "A house," Calder answered. Howard smiled thinly. "Most people start with something smaller." Calder nodded once. He did not explain further. By early autumn, Calder had enough. He bought a narrow plot of land just outside La Cienega, high enough to avoid runoff, solid enough to trust. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, no trees, no sweeping views, but the ground was firm, and the wind passed over it cleanly. Calder valued that. The first load of stone arrived on a cold morning when the sky looked pale and empty. Calder drove the truck himself, its suspension groaning under the weight. The stones were rough-cut sandstone, heavy and uneven, the color of baked earth. He unloaded them alone, one by one, setting them down carefully instead of dumping them into a pile. Each stone was placed with intention, already part of something larger. He worked for hours without stopping. His horse, a bay gelding named Moth, stood tied nearby, patient and half asleep. Moth was older, scarred, and steady. Like Calder, past his reckless years but still dependable. The two had an understanding that required no words. The first person to approach was Eliza Boone. Eliza was a widow in her early 70s, thin but upright, with white hair braided neatly down her back. Her skin was darkened by decades of sun, lined deeply but evenly, the face of someone who had lived outdoors and accepted it. She walked with a cane but didn't lean on it unless she had to. Her eyes were sharp and curious, the kind that measured before judging. "You're using stone," she said, stopping near the edge of the lot. "Yes, ma'am," Calder replied. "That's not common here." "No." Eliza studied the stones, then Calder. "Most folks build quick," she said. "Wood goes up fast." Calder glanced toward the hills where the wind was already beginning to rise. "Fast doesn't last long out here." Eliza nodded slowly. "The old people knew that," she said. "Stone holds on." She paused, then added, almost casually, "Just don't forget to let it breathe." Calder looked at her then, really looked. "I won't." Eliza smiled once, satisfied, and walked away without another word. By the end of the week, more people had noticed. 2 young ranch hands rode by and shouted jokes about castles and kings. Calder didn't respond. He kept stacking stone, aligning edges, checking levels. He had no interest in convincing anyone. He was building for weather, not for approval. As daylight shortened, the cold sharpened. The stones cooled quickly after sunset, radiating chill back into the air. Calder finished for the day, loaded his tools, and stood for a moment at the edge of the lot. The beginnings of the foundation looked small against the open land, almost insignificant, but Calder didn't measure progress by appearances. He measured it by whether it would endure. Winter was coming. He could feel it in the wind, in the way the nights tightened around the land. This time, he intended to be ready. By the time the first true frost hardened the ground, Calder Ridgeway's stone foundation had risen enough to draw more than passing curiosity. What had begun as a quiet personal project now sat plainly visible from the road, a low, deliberate outline of sandstone that refused to look temporary. The land around it was already showing signs of winter stress. Grass had thinned to pale straw, the soil had tightened and cracked, and the wind moved across the open ground with a sharper edge, as if it had learned where to cut. Calder worked steadily, not rushing, not stopping. Each morning he arrived before the sun fully cleared the hills, his breath fogging in the cold, his movements economical. He wore the same heavy coat he'd repaired twice already, gloves darkened by stone dust, hat pulled low. Moth stood nearby, tethered to a post. Calder had sunk deep into the ground, watching with the patience of an animal who trusted routine. The horse's coat had thickened with the season, his bay coloring dulled by dust and winter hair, one ear always angled toward Calder's movements. It was inevitable that someone with authority over building would come. Eldon Mercer arrived one afternoon as the light began to slant, riding a tall chestnut horse that matched his presence, solid, polished, and accustomed to being noticed. Mercer was 54, broad across the chest and thick through the arms, with a craftsman's strength that had not yet softened into age. His beard was full and carefully trimmed, streaked with gray, and his hair was kept short beneath a clean felt hat. His hands were large and scarred, but clean, a mark of someone who supervised as often as he worked. Eldon Mercer had built more houses in northern New Mexico than most men could count, and he carried that knowledge the way others carried rank. Mercer dismounted without haste and stood a moment, surveying the stonework. His eyes moved methodically, tracing lines, angles, spacing. He did not smile. "So it's true," he said at last. "You're serious about this?" Calder set down the stone he was positioning and wiped his hands on his jeans. "I don't build for practice," he replied. Mercer snorted softly, not unkindly, but dismissive. "Stone's fine for fences. Fine for barns if you've got time to waste. Houses are different." He stepped closer, boot scraping lightly over frozen dirt. "Wood flexes. Wood forgives. Stone doesn't." Calder met his gaze calmly. "Stone holds." Mercer's mouth tightened. He looked again at the foundation. "Holds weight," he said. "Holds cold. You'll freeze in there unless you plan to burn half the county to keep warm." Calder didn't argue. He'd learned that arguments were rarely won with words alone. "I plan to build it right," he said instead. Mercer studied him now, really studied him, the lean frame, the steady posture, the lack of defensiveness. "You know," Mercer said, "I've seen men ruin themselves with good intentions. Spend everything they have chasing an idea. Winter doesn't care how clever you think you are." Calder nodded once. "I know." Mercer mounted his horse again, shaking his head. "I won't take the job," he called over his shoulder, "but I won't stop you either." With that, he rode off, leaving the cold air quieter behind him. Word traveled quickly after that. If Eldon Mercer wouldn't build the house, others took it as a warning. But Calder wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for labor. He found it 2 days later in the form of Jonah Pike. Jonah was 38, lean and long-limbed, with a narrow face and a beard that grew in uneven patches, giving him a perpetually tired look. His hair was light brown and perpetually uncombed, and his eyes carried a restless intelligence that suggested he was always measuring alternatives. Jonah had once apprenticed under Mercer, but had left after a bitter disagreement over pay and credit. Since then, he took smaller jobs, repairs, anything that kept him working but never settled. "You really building a stone house?" Jonah asked, standing at the edge of the lot, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "Yes." "With winter coming?" "Yes." Jonah laughed once, sharp and surprised. "You're either brave or foolish." Calder shrugged. "I'm careful." That earned Jonah's attention. He walked the perimeter, crouched to examine the stonework, ran his fingers along a joint. "You're leaving gaps," he observed. "For air," Calder replied. Jonah straightened slowly. "You know," he said, "my grandfather built that way. Old country method, said air was cheaper than wood and better at holding heat." He squinted at Calder. "Most men forgot that." Calder didn't smile, but something eased in his chest. "Can you help?" he asked. Jonah nodded. "For fair pay." "You'll get it." They worked together after that. Jonah handled the rough shaping, Calder the placement. It wasn't fast, but it was precise. They spoke little, but when they did, it was practical. Measurements, angles, timing. Jonah brought with him a dog, a grizzled black and white cattle mix named Lark, 8 years old and limping slightly on her left hind leg. Lark had a scar across her muzzle and eyes that missed nothing. She lay near the stones while they worked, rising only when someone approached. Calder approved immediately. A dog that watched was worth more than one that barked. As the walls began to rise, so did skepticism. 2 ranch families stopped by one morning, their expressions a mix of curiosity and doubt. A younger woman named Ruth Calder, not related, stood with her arms crossed, her cheeks reddened by cold dark hair pulled into a tight braid. She was practical and blunt, known for speaking her mind. "Looks strong," she said. "Looks cold." Calder answered honestly. "Cold doesn't come from stone, it comes from wind." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "We'll see." By the end of the week, the walls stood chest high. Calder could already feel how the stone changed the space inside, blocking the wind, holding stillness. At night, he sat within the rising structure, fire small, testing how the air moved, or didn't. The temperature dropped hard after sundown, but inside the stone, the change came slower. Calder noted it carefully. Not everyone dismissed the work. Eliza Boone returned one afternoon, bringing a basket of bread wrapped in cloth. "Men like Mercer build for speed," she said, setting the basket down. "Men like you build for memory. This land remembers winter." Calder thanked her and shared the bread with Jonah and Lark. Eliza watched the walls and nodded. "You're doing it right," she said simply. As November crept closer, the wind sharpened. Snow dusted the ground once, twice, not enough to stay but enough to warn. Calder pushed harder, not in panic but with focus. The roof supports had to be set before the ground froze completely. Jonah worked longer hours. Even Mercer rode by again, silent this time, eyes narrowed in thought. One night, as Calder secured a support beam, a sudden gust tore across the open ground, rattling loose boards and lifting dust into the air. Jonah paused, bracing himself. "Winter's testing you," Jonah said. Calder tightened the final bolt and stepped back. "Let it," he replied. The stone walls stood unmoved, quiet against the wind. November tightened its grip without apology. The mornings hardened first, the ground ringing faintly beneath boots like a thin sheet of glass. By afternoon, the sun offered a pale warmth that fooled no one, and by dusk the cold returned sharper, more deliberate. Wind crossed the open land near La Cienega with practiced confidence, probing edges, seams, unfinished corners, learning the shape of things the way water learns a channel. Calder Ridgway felt the change in his hands before he saw it anywhere else. Stone dust clung longer, leather stiffened sooner, breath came out thick and white even when he worked. He adjusted his pace accordingly, not faster, not slower, simply steadier. Rushing invited mistakes, hesitation invited cold. The walls had reached shoulder height, their thickness now unmistakable. Sandstone blocks locked together in a pattern that favored weight over elegance, each course set with care, each joint considered. Jonah Pike moved along the perimeter with a mason's quiet economy, trimming rough edges, checking level with a short brass tool he'd inherited from his grandfather. Jonah's beard had grown fuller in the cold, the uneven patches filling in, giving his narrow face a more settled look. He spoke little while working, but when he did, it was with the authority of someone who had tested ideas against failure. "You'll want the inner surface smoother," Jonah said one morning, running his palm along the stone. "Not pretty, just even. Air likes predictability." Calder nodded. "I've noticed." They were not alone anymore. Curiosity had turned into traffic. Wagons slowed as they passed. Riders paused at the fence line. Most said nothing. A few offered opinions that were more habit than insight. Calder accepted neither praise nor criticism with much reaction. He listened for information, not approval. The roof supports came next, and with them a decision that would not be easily reversed. Calder chose timber sparingly and deliberately. Dense beams, properly seasoned, set into stone pockets that Jonah cut with care. The beams were not decorative, they were load paths. Their placement created a shallow grid, a skeleton meant to carry weight without concentrating it. The work took time. Fingers numbed quickly. Mistakes were costly. Jonah complained once about the cold and then stopped complaining altogether, the way men do when they realize discomfort is not an argument. It was during this stage that a new presence joined the edges of the site. Silas Crow arrived on foot one afternoon, leaning heavily on a hickory cane polished smooth by use. He was 61, tall but bent forward at the shoulders, his frame thinned by years of illness that had never quite claimed him. His beard was long and iron gray, left untrimmed not from neglect but from indifference. His eyes were pale and penetrating, the color of winter skull set deep beneath brows that seemed permanently drawn together. Silas had once been a surveyor, before a fall from a horse crushed his hip and changed the arc of his days. Since then, he walked the land slowly, measuring it with his eyes instead of instruments. "You're setting for load transfer," Silas said without greeting, watching Jonah sink a beam into its seat. Calder turned, surprised. "Yes." Silas nodded to himself. People forget roofs aren't just covers. They're weights that need somewhere to go. He shifted his cane in the dirt, sketching a quick diagram. "Most houses fail at the top because they're built like hats." Jonah glanced over, curious. "And this one?" Silas studied the grid, the stone, the spacing. "This one wants to be a spine." Calder liked that. He didn't say so, but he liked it. Silas returned twice more that week, never staying long, always observing. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with a bluntness that carried no malice. He pointed out a place where water might pool. He warned of wind shear from the north cut. Calder adjusted accordingly. When Silas stopped coming, Calder took it as a quiet endorsement. The first real snow arrived on a night when the moon hung thin and sharp. It didn't last. By morning, the ground showed only damp patches and a faint memory of white in the shadows, but it was enough to test the walls, enough to teach. Inside the structure, Calder noticed something subtle. The wind, which howled freely outside, lost its voice once it crossed the stone. There was no whistle, no rattle, just stillness. The temperature still dropped, but not abruptly. The change felt buffered, as if the air itself had decided to linger. He lit a small fire and watched how the warmth moved. It rose, slowed, spread. Jonah noticed too, setting his hands near the inner wall and frowning in concentration. "It's not bleeding out," he said. "It's staying put." Calder nodded. "That's the idea." Not everyone was convinced. Eldon Mercer rode by again the following afternoon, slower this time, his chestnut horse stepping carefully over frozen ruts. Mercer dismounted and stood with his arms crossed, his thick coat buttoned tight. The wind tugged at his beard, silver strands catching the light. "You're past the point of no return," Mercer said. Calder met his gaze. "I passed that when I laid stone." Mercer snorted, but there was less certainty in it now. "I've seen houses fail for less," he said, "and I've seen stubborn men bury themselves under good intentions." Calder didn't bristle. "You've seen a lot," he agreed. Mercer studied the roof supports, the wall thickness, the way the openings were framed deep rather than wide. "If this goes wrong," he said, "it'll go wrong all at once." Calder answered calmly, "Then I'll learn from it." Mercer mounted his horse without another word. He didn't look back this time. As the days shortened, Calder added another element, one that drew sharper reactions than stone ever had. He began constructing an outer line of stone just beyond the main walls, low and incomplete, creating a narrow cavity that ran around the structure like a shadow. It wasn't wide enough to walk through, but wide enough to breathe. Jonah raised an eyebrow. "You're doubling it," he said. "Yes. People already think you're halfway mad." Calder allowed himself a thin smile. "Halfway is an improvement." The cavity was deliberate. Calder left openings at the base and narrow vents near the top, small enough to resist wind but large enough to move air slowly. The work was precise, almost fussy. Jonah helped without argument, though he shook his head more than once. "This is where men stop," Jonah said one evening, voice low as the cold deepened, "and where stories start." Calder didn't answer. He was listening to the wind, the way it pressed and slid, testing the new shapes. The sound changed, dulled. The structure didn't answer back. Lark, Jonah's dog, noticed first. She chose to sleep inside the cavity's lee rather than by the fire, curling against the stone with a grunt of approval. Her breath slowed there. Her body relaxed. Animals noticed what people debated. A week later, the temperature dropped hard, 10 degrees overnight. Frost formed thick on exposed beams elsewhere in La Cienega. Doors stuck, pipes groaned. Calder slept inside the unfinished house, wrapped in blankets, fire minimal. He woke before dawn to a quiet that felt earned. The air inside was cold but not bitter. The difference mattered. Eliza Boone visited again, her cane crunching over frozen dirt. She stepped inside, paused, and closed her eyes briefly. "It holds," she said. Calder poured her coffee from a battered tin pot. She accepted it with both hands. "You know," she added, "people don't fear stone. They fear what it proves." Calder considered that. "What does it prove?" "That patience outlasts hurry," Eliza said, "and that memory beats fashion." By late November, word had spread beyond La Cienega. Some came to mock, others came to measure. A few came quietly, asking questions they didn't want overheard. Calder answered plainly. He did not preach, he showed. The final act of the chapter came not with disaster, but with pressure. A windstorm rolled in from the north, sudden and aggressive. It tore shingles from lesser buildings and flattened a fence 2 properties over. Jonah and Calder braced the sight and stepped back, watching. The stone did not move. The cavity whispered. The structure absorbed and refused. When the wind passed, the land lay scoured and silent. Calder stood in the cold light and felt something settle, not pride, not relief, but confirmation. Winter had learned the walls. December arrived without warning, the way hard things often do. One day, the light still carried a hint of warmth at noon. The next, it vanished as if withdrawn by decision. The land around La Cienega stiffened and dulled, colors leaching into a narrow palette of stone, ski, and frost-burned grass. The The wind no longer wandered. It arrived with intent, leaning into walls, fences, and people, testing them the way a craftsman tests a joint before trusting it with weight. Calder Ridgway finished the roof frame under that pressure. The grid of beams lay tight and deliberate atop the stone, each joint seated clean, each span measured to move load outward rather than down. Jonah Pike worked beside him, shoulders hunched against the cold, breath rasping as it met the air. They had learned each other's rhythms by then, when to speak, when to step aside, when to let the other finish a thought with hands instead of words. The cavity Calder had built, the narrow band of air between stone layers, now ran unbroken around the structure. It was no longer theoretical, it was physical, present, quietly doing its work. Wind struck the outer face and lost its edge. Inside, the air moved slowly, obediently, as if it had accepted the rules of the place. Jonah tested it with a candle one evening, holding the flame near a vent. The fire bent slightly, then steadied. "It's not pulling," he said. "It's breathing." Calder nodded. "That's what I want." They were not alone that night. A woman arrived just before dusk, leading a small mule by a rope that had been repaired more times than replaced. She introduced herself as Sarah Calloway. She was 32, of medium height, built spare rather than thin, with the straight-backed posture of someone used to carrying weight without complaint. Her hair was the color of dark wheat, worn long and tied low to keep it from her face. Wind and sun had roughened her skin, but her eyes, hazel, clear, assessing, missed nothing. She dressed plainly, wool coat patched at the elbows, gloves worn thin at the fingers. There was a calm to her that came from necessity, not comfort. "I was told you might need help," she said, voice steady. "I can cook, I can haul, I can stay out of the way." Calder studied her briefly, not suspicious, just thorough. "Why?" he asked. Sarah glanced toward the hills where the light was already fading. "Because winter's going to take something from this place," she said. "I'd rather be useful than surprised." She explained without drama that she'd lost her husband the previous winter when a fever moved faster than help. Since then, she'd taken work wherever it came, learned not to depend on promises that weather could break. Her mule, an older gray named Ash, stood patiently, ribs showing faintly beneath a thickening coat, eyes half-lidded but alert. Calder looked at Jonah. Jonah shrugged once. "We could use another pair of hands," he said. Sarah stayed. She proved useful immediately. She cooked simple meals that warmed without wasting fuel. She organized tools so they could be found in the dark. She noticed things others missed, where snow drifted, where meltwater pooled, where wind pressed hardest. She did not ask questions that didn't matter. She did not comment on the stone, only worked around it with respect. That night, the cold dropped sharply. 15 degrees in an hour. Elsewhere in La Cienega, doors jammed and pipes groaned. A shallow roof collapsed on a shed near the creek, its boards snapping under a sudden weight of snow that fell wet and heavy before freezing solid. People swore in the dark and cursed their luck. At Calder's place, the unfinished house held. Inside, the temperature fell, but slowly. Calder measured it with his hands, with his breath, with attention. The stone absorbed the loss and released it reluctantly, buying time. Sarah noticed too, sitting near the inner wall with a blanket around her shoulders. "It's different," she said quietly. "It doesn't rush at you." "No," Calder replied. "It doesn't." By morning, the wind had shifted north and strengthened. Snow followed, dry this time, driven hard enough to sting exposed skin. Jonah and Calder secured what they could and retreated inside. Lark, Jonah's old dog, circled twice and settled against the lee stone, her scarred muzzle tucked under her tail. Even Moth seemed calmer, shifting his weight but not pulling at the tether. Animals felt changes before people trusted them. Word spread quickly when the storm did not break. A ranch hand named Peter Rusk arrived near midday, hat pulled low, beard rimed with frost. Peter was in his late 20s, broad-faced and earnest, known more for strength than judgment. He had been sent by his employer to check fences, but had turned back when the snow thickened. "I heard your place was standing," he said, voice raised over the wind. "Mind if I waited out?" Calder waved him in without comment. An hour later came Miriam Holland, a schoolteacher with wire-framed glasses and a wool coat that hung loose on her narrow frame. She was 40, severe in posture, softened by fatigue. "My stove won't draw, she said. Smoke's filling the room. Stay, Calder told her. They did not advertise. They didn't need to. The storm carried the message. By late afternoon, 7 people occupied the unfinished house, sitting on crates and stacked blankets, sharing heat and silence. Sarah moved among them with calm efficiency, pouring broth, checking fingers for numbness. Jonah watched the walls, still half expecting them to answer the wind with complaint. They did not. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow piled against lesser buildings, filling gaps, exploiting weaknesses. A loud crack echoed across the flats when a roof beam failed somewhere to the east. No one spoke. The sound said enough. Eldon Mercer arrived just before dark. He came alone, on foot, his chestnut horse left behind where the road had become impassable. His beard was stiff with ice, his coat dusted white. He didn't look proud. He didn't look ashamed. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and accepted its result. "I won't stay long," he said, stepping inside. "You can stay as long as you need," Calder replied. Mercer removed his gloves slowly, flexing his fingers. He looked around the interior, the stone, the vents, the way the fire's warmth spread without urgency. "I've been building houses for 30 years, he said, not to anyone in particular. "I've lost 3 to winter, maybe 4. I always said that was the price of doing business." He met Calder's eyes. "Maybe it doesn't have to be." Calder said nothing. He had learned that realizations arrived best without assistance. The storm raged through the night. Wind pressed and released, pressed again. Snow hissed against stone. Inside, the air remained tolerable, not warm, not comfortable, but survivable without desperation. That difference mattered. Sarah slept sitting up, head against the wall, her breathing slow and even. Jonah dozed near the fire, boots still on. Mercer stayed awake, watching, measuring, revising old beliefs in silence. When morning came, pale and hard, the storm eased. The land lay reshaped, drifts where roads had been, fences half buried, roofs sagging under weight they were never meant to carry. People emerged cautiously, counting damage, counting luck. Calder stepped outside and took in the scene without comment. The stone walls stood unchanged. The vents were clear. The cavity had done its work. Winter had made its first real demand. The house had answered. The days after the storm did not bring relief so much as accounting. La Cienega woke to the quiet work of assessment, the counting of broken beams, the shoveling of drifts that had hardened into ridges, the slow recognition of what would need repair before the next front arrived. Winter was not finished. It had merely introduced itself. Calder Ridgway returned to work at first light, not because the house needed it immediately, but because routine steadied people when uncertainty lingered. He cleared vents, checked stone joints for hairline shifts, tested the roof frame with deliberate pressure. Nothing had moved. The structure had not argued with the storm. It had simply absorbed and declined it. That distinction mattered to Calder. Resistance broke things. Endurance preserved them. Inside, the house felt different now that it had been occupied under stress. The air carried the memory of bodies and breath, of shared warmth and shared silence. Sarah Calloway rose early and put water on the fire without asking, her movements economical, her posture straight despite the cold. She had slept little, but it showed only in the faint shadows under her eyes. Loss had trained her to function even when rest was incomplete. "You'll have people coming today," she said, handing Calder a tin cup. "Yes. They won't all say what they mean." Calder accepted the cup. "They never do." By mid-morning, the first arrived. Eldon Mercer returned with 2 men in tow, both younger, both dressed for work rather than inspection. Mercer himself looked changed, not in confidence, but in weight. The storm had stripped something from him, not pride exactly, but the certainty that pride fed on. He introduced the men without ceremony. Thomas Reed, Owen Bishop. Thomas Reed was 41, broad-shouldered and thick through the neck, with hands that bore the heavy calluses of saw and hammer. His beard was dark and trimmed short, his hairline already retreating. He carried himself like someone used to being given instructions and carrying them out without embellishment. Owen Bishop was younger, 26 at most, lean and sharp-eyed, his beard sparse and his movements quick. He had the restless energy of a man still deciding what kind of craftsman he would become. "We came to look," Mercer said. "Not to judge." Calder nodded. "Then look." They walked the perimeter slowly. Mercer asked questions he would not have asked a month earlier, about spacing, about vent placement, about why the outer stone sat the way it did. Calder answered plainly, without triumph. He did not oversell. He did not defend. He described. "This isn't about strength," Calder said, tapping the inner wall. "It's about time. How fast heat leaves. How fast cold enters." Thomas Reed grunted. "Makes sense," he said. "Most houses bleed." Owen Bishop crouched near a vent, peering inside. "You're letting it move," he said, "but slowly." "Yes." Owen straightened, impressed despite himself. "I've never seen anyone do it with stone." Mercer watched Calder closely then. "I've got a job coming up," he said. "Out by the arroyo. Family with 3 kids. Their place didn't hold." He paused. "They can't afford to gamble on another failure." Calder met his gaze. "Then don't gamble." Mercer exhaled through his nose. "I want to try this. With your input." It wasn't an apology. Calder didn't need one. "I'll help," he said. That afternoon, Sarah took a walk through town for the first time since the storm. She moved carefully, avoiding drifts that hid uneven ground, nodding to people she knew and people she did not. She stopped at Miriam Holland's house, where smoke now drew properly from the chimney, and at Peter Rusk's bunkhouse, where men were already reinforcing a sagging roof. She listened more than she spoke. When she returned, she brought news. "2 families lost everything," she said quietly. "Not roofs, walls. One of them's got a newborn." Calder's jaw tightened. He looked toward the hills. "We'll make space." Jonah Pike overheard and shook his head. "This isn't a shelter," he said, not unkindly. "It's a house." Calder didn't argue. He considered. Then he nodded. "It's both," he said. The house began to change, not in structure, but in purpose. They partitioned space with blankets and temporary screens. Sarah organized sleeping arrangements with firm kindness, placing children where drafts were weakest, older folks closer to the fire, but not crowded. Lark patrolled the perimeter with quiet authority, choosing vantage points that allowed her to see without being seen. Moth stood steady outside, snow dusting his mane, unfazed by the comings and goings. One of the new arrivals was a man named Henry Cole, 52, with a stoop that came from years of carrying loads too heavy for one back. His beard was unkempt and shot through with white, his face lined deeply around the eyes. He spoke rarely and flinched at sudden sounds. Sarah noticed and learned why later. Henry had been inside a house when a roof beam failed during the storm, had clawed his way out through snow and debris. Since then, enclosed spaces made him tense. Calder showed him the vents, the thickness of the walls, the way light entered deep-set windows without inviting cold. Henry listened, nodded once, and slept that night without waking. As days passed, something else settled over the house, a gravity that had nothing to do with stone. People began to bring what they could: a sack of beans, a coil of rope, a tin of nails salvaged from a collapsed shed. No one called it payment. No one needed to. The house had become a point of exchange, not just for shelter, but for trust. Mercer returned often, sometimes with questions, sometimes just to stand and think. Thomas Reed began sketching variations on the design, adapting it to wood where stone wasn't feasible. Owen Bishop asked Calder to explain again how the vents were sized, why they were placed where they were. Calder explained patiently, more teacher than builder now. "You ever think about why no one does this anymore?" Owen asked one evening. Calder considered. "People forget what worked when the weather changes for a while," he said. "Then it changes back." Late one night, when the fire burned low and most slept, Sarah and Calder sat near the inner wall, backs to stone, cups cooling in their hands. Outside, the wind moved restlessly, but it no longer sounded like a threat. "You didn't plan this," Sarah said. "No." "But you made room for it." "Yes." She nodded. "That's the difference." Calder looked at her then, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with recognition. She carried herself like someone who had learned the cost of assuming tomorrow would be kind. It was a language he understood. The next storm arrived 3 days later, lighter than the first, but colder. Snow fell steadily through the night, dry and insistent. Elsewhere, roofs groaned. Here, the house held its breath and waited it out. The temperature inside dipped, then steadied. Children slept through it. Adults stayed alert but unafraid. In the morning, Mercer stood at the doorway, looking out at the altered land. "This isn't just a house," he said. "It's a standard." Calder did not correct him. Winter pressed on, but it no longer pressed alone. The weight the house carried now included people, knowledge, and the quiet shift of a community learning how to endure together. By mid-January, winter stopped pretending it might ease. The land around La Cienega lay locked beneath a hard crust of snow that no longer melted at noon. Days passed under a pale sun that offered light without warmth, and nights arrived early, heavy and absolute. The wind had changed character. It no longer tested playfully. It moved with purpose, carrying cold dense enough to feel like weight. Calder Ridgway sensed it coming days before anyone spoke the word storm. He noticed it in Moth's behavior first. The old bay gelding shifted more often in his tether, turning his hindquarters instinctively toward the north, even when the wind was still mild. His ears stayed angled back, listening to something distant. Lark, Jonah's dog, stopped sleeping near the doorway and chose instead the deepest lee of the inner wall, her scarred muzzle pressed against stone, breath slow and deliberate. Animals knew when the land was drawing breath. Calder adjusted accordingly. He checked vents twice a day, cleared ice before it thickened, reinforced temporary partitions inside. He rationed fuel without announcing it, trusting the stone and the air gap to do their work. Jonah noticed but didn't comment. By now, he trusted Calder's instincts the way sailors trust a seasoned hand who feels weather in his bones. Sarah Calloway moved through the house with quiet authority. She had taken to the role not by appointment, but by necessity. At 32, she carried herself with the economy of someone who had learned to manage exhaustion without complaint. Her hazel eyes tracked people constantly, who ate, who didn't, who lingered too close to the fire, who stared too long at the walls as if expecting them to fail. Loss had taught her vigilance. She didn't panic. She prepared. "People will come before nightfall," she said to Calder that morning, tying her hair back against the cold. "This one feels bigger." Calder nodded. "We'll make room." The storm arrived just after dusk. It did not announce itself with thunder or spectacle. It arrived as pressure, a sudden, oppressive stillness followed by wind so sharp it seemed to cut sound itself in half. Snow followed quickly, driven nearly horizontal, filling tracks as fast as they were made. Within an hour, visibility dropped to nothing beyond a few yards. Roads vanished, landmarks dissolved. The first knock came hard and urgent. A man stood outside, wrapped in a patched coat too thin for the cold, beard rimed with ice, eyes wide with the strain of exposure. His name was Caleb Monroe, 45, a shearer by trade whose livelihood depended on seasons behaving predictably. He was tall but gaunt, his face hollowed by recent hardship. He had been caught halfway between jobs when the storm closed in. "Please," he said simply. Calder opened the door fully. Behind Caleb came others, families, individuals, some on foot, some led by instinct more than direction. Sarah took charge immediately, assigning spaces, counting heads. Jonah secured the door and reinforced the frame with a timber brace he'd prepared days earlier, not knowing exactly why, only that it might be needed. By midnight, 22 people occupied the house. The air changed with their presence, warmer, heavier, damp with breath. Calder watched carefully for condensation, for signs of imbalance. The vents worked slowly, deliberately, exchanging air without inviting cold. The stone walls absorbed sound, turning the chaos of arrival into a muted murmur. Fear did not echo here. Outside, the storm intensified beyond prediction. Wind screamed across the flats, carrying snow dense enough to scour exposed skin raw. Roofs elsewhere began to fail, not all at once but in sequence, like dominoes tipped by invisible hands. A sharp crack echoed through the night when a beam snapped somewhere to the east. A woman near the fire flinched violently. Sarah knelt beside her, grounding her with a steady hand. "Listen," Sarah said softly. "The sound is far. This house hasn't moved." Calder heard Mercer arrive before he saw him. Eldon Mercer fought his way through the storm near dawn, face drawn tight, shoulders hunched against wind that had no respect for reputation. He entered without ceremony, stamping snow from his boots, eyes scanning the structure like a man assessing a lifeboat in open sea. "It's worse than anything I've seen," Mercer said hoarsely. North Ridge is gone. 2 houses collapsed outright. Calder nodded. Anyone hurt? Not yet, Mercer said. Not if they get here. They did. By the second night, the count rose to 31. Among them was a young couple, Daniel and Ruth Alvarez, both under 30, their first child wrapped tightly between them. Daniel was compact and broad-chested, his beard thick and black, his hands shaking from cold he refused to acknowledge. Ruth was smaller, her dark hair braided tightly, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. She watched the walls constantly, one hand always on the child. Calder showed Daniel the structure, the vents, the thickness of the stone. Daniel listened, nodded, and for the first time since arriving, unclenched his jaw. The house did not fail. The temperature dropped further, far below what Calder had planned for, what anyone in La Cienega remembered enduring for so long. Firewood burned steadily, but not desperately. The stone moderated swings, the air gap slowed loss. The house held at a level not comfortable, but survivable without panic. Jonah monitored the roof frame hourly, fingers numb, eyes alert. Loads holding, he reported each time. Snow's shedding. Lark lay watchful, rising occasionally to reposition, as if patrolling an invisible line. Moth stood with his back to the wind, snow crusting his mane, but he did not pull. Trust ran deep. The third night was the hardest. Wind howled without pause. Snow piled faster than anyone could clear elsewhere. Inside the house, a child developed a fever. Sarah tended to him with practiced calm, using cool cloths and careful timing. Miriam Holland assisted, her teacher's discipline translating easily into quiet caregiving. Calder sat near the wall, listening, not to the storm, but to the structure. Stone made its own sounds under stress, small settling murmurs, harmless shifts. Nothing cracked, nothing screamed. At dawn on the 4th day, the wind finally broke. It didn't fade gently. It stopped as if someone had shut a door. The silence that followed was profound. People emerged slowly, blinking, disbelieving. The land lay transformed. Buried fences, collapsed roofs, drifted roads. The count came in grimly as daylight spread. 7 houses destroyed. 11 more unsafe to occupy. No deaths. Every survivor had passed through Calder's house. Mercer stood outside, shoulders slumped, staring at the stone walls as if seeing them for the first time. This wasn't luck, he said quietly. No, Calder agreed. It wasn't. By evening, the storm had become history, but its measure remained. The house stood unchanged. The storm left behind a silence that felt heavier than the wind had ever been. La Cienega woke slowly, as if unsure whether the world outside the stone walls was safe to trust again. Snow lay packed hard against fences and doorways, shaped by days of relentless force into drifts that looked almost deliberate. Rooflines sagged where they had survived at all. Smoke rose thin and uncertain from a handful of chimneys, each plume a quiet signal that someone inside had made it through the night. Calder Ridgway stepped out first, not out of courage but habit. He moved carefully, boots crunching against crusted snow, testing the ground before committing his weight. The cold was still deep, but it had lost its edge. It no longer pressed. It lingered. Behind him, the stone house stood unchanged. No cracks, no shifts. The vents were clear. Snow had piled against the outer walls but never forced its way inside. Calder placed his palm flat against the stone, feeling the faint residual warmth held there, slow to leave. The house had not just survived. It had remembered what it was built to do. People followed him out in stages, blinking against the pale light. Sarah Calloway emerged carrying a bundled child, her posture steady, her breath calm. She scanned the surroundings the way she always did, first for danger, then for need. Jonah Pike came next, shoulders stiff, eyes moving automatically to the roofline. He let out a long breath when he confirmed what he already suspected. She didn't move, he said quietly. No, Calder replied. She didn't. Eldon Mercer stood apart from the others, hat in hand, his thick beard uncombed, streaked with white frost that had not fully melted. He looked older than he had before the storm, not weaker, but stripped of excess. The certainty that had once anchored him had been replaced by something heavier and more honest. I counted this morning, Mercer said. 7 houses gone, 11 more unlivable until spring. Calder nodded. He had expected worse. And everyone who lived, Mercer continued, voice rough, passed through your door. That fact settled over the group quietly. No one celebrated it. Survival did not ask for applause. The day unfolded into labor. Men and women dispersed to check on neighbors, to dig out doorways, to retrieve what could be salvaged before another freeze set in. Calder lent tools freely, no record kept. Jonah organized small crews instinctively, assigning tasks without raising his voice. Lark followed him at a distance, her limp more pronounced in the cold, but her attention sharp as ever. She paused often, ears lifting, making sure no one strayed too far alone. Mid-morning brought a stranger. He arrived on a narrow sled pulled by a compact sorrel horse, whose flanks steamed faintly in the cold air. The man guiding it was in his early 40s, tall and narrow, with a face marked by long angles and a carefully kept beard that suggested discipline rather than vanity. His coat was military surplus, patched but clean, and his boots were well cared for. He introduced himself as Samuel Ortega. Ortega had been a rail engineer once before an accident took 3 fingers from his left hand and redirected his life inland. Since then, he worked wherever structure and problem-solving were needed: bridges, retaining walls, drainage systems. He spoke precisely, choosing words with care, his dark eyes constantly assessing load, slope, and failure points. "I was sent to see it," Ortega said simply, nodding toward the stone house. "By whom?" Calder asked. "By people who don't like losing workers to winter," Ortega replied. Calder showed him the structure without embellishment. Ortega walked the perimeter slowly, measured vent openings with his eye, tapped stone with his knuckles, listened. When he finally spoke, it was with restrained respect. "This isn't improvisation," he said. "It's applied memory." "That's one way to put it," Calder replied. Ortega looked at him sharply. "You didn't invent this. You remembered it." Calder did not correct him. Inside the house, the mood shifted subtly as the day wore on. Fear receded, replaced by fatigue and something like resolve. People began making plans, not for survival that night, but for the weeks ahead. Sarah listened, contributed when necessary, but mostly watched how people interacted with the space, who gravitated toward the walls, who avoided corners, who slept soundly for the first time in days. She noticed Mercer standing alone near the far vent, studying airflow the way a man studies a map he intends to follow. "You thinking about rebuilding?" she asked. Mercer nodded. "Differently." That evening, a meeting formed without announcement. It happened the way practical things often do. People gathered where warmth and clarity already existed. Calder did not call it. He did not lead it. He listened. Thomas Reed spoke first, voice low and steady. "We can't put things back the way they were." Owen Bishop followed, eager but serious. "Not if we don't want this again." Others added observations, not complaints: roof pitches, wall thickness, materials that had failed and those that hadn't. The conversation stayed grounded. No one spoke of blame. When Calder finally spoke, it was only to answer a question. "How much does it cost?" someone asked. "Time," Calder said. "Mostly time." Samuel Ortega nodded. "Time is cheaper than funerals." No one argued. As dusk settled, Sarah stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter against the returning cold. Calder joined her, standing shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the altered land. "You didn't plan to change this place," she said. "No. But you did." Calder considered that. "The place changed itself," he said. "I just built something that could stay when it did." Sarah studied him then, not with gratitude, not with awe, but with understanding. "You carry weight well," she said. "Most men try to set it down." Calder smiled faintly at that. The next morning, work resumed, not on Calder's house, but on others. Mercer took point on the first rebuild, applying what he had learned with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. Ortega stayed to advise, sketching load paths in the snow with his gloved hand. Jonah moved between crews, translating concept into action. The stone house became a reference point, a quiet teacher that did not need to speak. By the end of the week, the rhythm of the community had changed. There was still loss, still cold, but there was also direction. One evening, as Calder checked the vents one last time, he noticed something unexpected. The house no longer felt like a refuge waiting for disaster. It felt like an anchor, something that held even when nothing pulled against it. Winter was not done. Everyone knew that, but neither was the work. Spring did not arrive in La Cienega with celebration. It arrived cautiously, as if the land itself was unsure it was welcome. Snow receded in patches rather than all at once, revealing soil darkened by moisture and work. The wind softened but did not disappear. It moved differently now, less like an enemy, more like a reminder. Calder Ridgway noticed the change in the mornings. Light lingered a little longer on the stone walls. Meltwater traced careful paths away from foundations that had been laid with foresight. The house stood unchanged, but its role had shifted. It was no longer simply the place that it held. It had become the place people measured themselves against. Rebuilding took on a rhythm that surprised everyone. Eldon Mercer worked harder than anyone. At 54, he rose before most of the younger men, beard trimmed again, hands roughened by renewed labor. Pride had not left him. It had been repurposed. He no longer built to prove speed or reputation. He built to avoid regret. People noticed the difference in his posture, the way he paused before decisions he once made automatically. Losing certainty had made him better. Jonah Pike took on more responsibility than he'd ever held. His restless energy found direction in teaching, showing younger workers how to read stone grain, how to seat beams so weight traveled outward instead of down. His voice carried confidence now, not borrowed from older men, but earned through survival. Lark followed him faithfully, muzzle graying further, her limp worsening, but her presence calming crews the way it always had. Samuel Ortega stayed longer than planned. He camped near the edge of town, mapping drainage, advising on load paths, sketching designs in charcoal on scrap wood. His missing fingers slowed him, but they had also sharpened his thinking. He spoke often with Mercer, the two men arguing quietly, respectfully, refining methods neither would have considered alone. Knowledge moved freely between them, no longer guarded. Sarah Calloway became indispensable without ever claiming authority. She organized supplies, tracked families' needs, and noticed the quiet fractures that rebuilding exposed, grief that resurfaced when walls came down, exhaustion that set in after adrenaline faded. She spoke plainly, listened carefully, and never assumed strength meant silence. People trusted her because she did not dramatize pain or minimize it. She treated it as a condition that required attention. Calder watched all of this without interference. He continued his own work, finishing the interior of the stone house properly now. The floors were laid with care. Shelves were built into the thick walls, deep enough to hold warmth as well as tools. Windows were set back, their frames angled to accept light but discourage wind. Nothing was rushed, nothing was ornamental. One afternoon, as Calder worked alone inside, Sarah stepped in quietly. She stood near the inner wall, palm resting against stone. "It feels different now," she said. "Yes." "Not warmer," she clarified. "More settled." Calder considered. "So are we." Sarah smiled faintly at that. As spring advanced, word traveled beyond La Cienega. Men came from neighboring settlements to see the house. Some came skeptical, arms crossed, ready to dismiss what they didn't understand. Others came cautiously hopeful. Calder showed them what mattered and ignored what didn't. He explained the logic of air and stone, the patience required, the cost measured in weeks rather than dollars. He didn't promise safety. He promised resilience. One visitor stood out. His name was Henry Watts, a county official in his early 50s, broad-bodied with thinning hair and a trimmed mustache that failed to hide his discomfort in the cold. He dressed well for an office man and poorly for the land. But his eyes were alert, and his questions were precise. "You're telling me this design could be replicated," Watts said, pacing the interior. "Scaled." "Yes." "And the material?" "Local," Calder replied. "Stone where you have it, wood adapted where you don't. The principle stays." Watts stopped pacing. "This winter," he said slowly, "cost the county more than I want to explain. Relief funds, repairs, losses that don't show up on paper." He looked at Calder. "People don't like change, but they hate repeat disasters more." Calder nodded. "Then give them something that lasts." By late April, 3 new houses stood rising on the outskirts of La Cienega, each different in detail, each identical in principle. Mercer oversaw one, Jonah another. Ortega advised all 3. The stone house remained the reference point, the place people returned to when a question resisted easy answers. Lark did not live to see them finished. She passed quietly one night, curled against the inner wall she had chosen so many times before. Jonah found her at dawn, hand resting on her grizzled neck, tears freezing before they could fall. The loss cut deeper than he expected. Calder helped bury her near the lee side of the house, stone marking the spot. No words were needed. Some guardians did their work without ever asking to be remembered. Moth aged more slowly. He moved stiffly some mornings, but spring grass revived him. Calder brushed him longer now, talked to him more, as if aware that steadiness was something to be acknowledged while it remained. The final proof came not with disaster, but with normalcy. The next winter arrived and passed without incident. Storms came, but no roofs failed. No families fled in the night. Fires burned steadily, not desperately. Woodpiles lasted longer. People slept. In La Cienega, the phrase "like Calder's house" entered common speech. It meant solid. It meant prepared. It meant built by someone who had paid attention. Calder never corrected anyone who called it his, but privately, he knew better. It belonged to everyone who had tested it with fear, warmth, doubt, and trust. One evening, as the second winter gave way to early thaw, Calder stood outside with Sarah, watching children play near one of the new houses, their laughter carried lightly in the cold air, unafraid. "You could leave," Sarah said. "Take work elsewhere. People would understand." Calder shook his head. "I already built what I came to build." Sarah studied him. "A house?" "A place where people stay," he replied. She nodded, satisfied. The stone walls behind them held the day's warmth a little longer before giving it back to the night. They had done that since the beginning. They would continue to do so long after those who built them were gone. That was the quiet promise Calder Ridgway had kept. Sometimes God does not arrive with thunder. He arrives quietly, in steady hands, in patient choices, in a man who builds something stronger than fear when no one is watching. The miracle was not that the storm came. The miracle was that someone prepared long before it did. In our own lives, we face storms too. Illness, loss, loneliness, moments when the night feels too cold and help feels too far away. And yet, again and again, God places shelter among us, through kindness, through wisdom, through people who choose to stand firm instead of turning away. If this story reminded you that quiet faith still matters, that preparation is love, and that no child, no animal, and no soul should ever face fear alone, then share this story with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let us pray for one another across distance and time. And if you believe that even the forgotten are seen by God, subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing stories that restore faith, one quiet miracle at a time. May God bless you, protect your home, and keep you warm through every storm ahead.